Hello, everybody, wherever you are. And Simon, thank you for your kind words. The way I envisage these reading sessions is like a group of friends sitting down at a table, maybe with a drink, only we won't have a drink with us this evening, chatting away, reading Ruskin, and then discussing him together. And with other friends, you um, joining us, if you feel moved to do so. So my introduction is an introduction to this evening, but it's also an introduction to the whole series. Like all Ruskin's writings, the 4 essays of Unto This Last need to be seen in their context. In volume 17 of the library edition of Ruskin's works are gathered together all those writings of his which were devoted exclusively to political economy. They date from 1860 to 1867, and they are as follows. Unto This Last, Munera Pulveris, Time and Tide. As you know, Ruskin was the master of the mystifying title. These 3 books were all written out of what might be called the same temper. They deal from different starting points with the same topics, and they form progressive parts of a comprehensive scheme. Unto This Last delivered Ruskin's first general attack on the political economy of the time at which he was writing. Munera Pulveris set forth his idea of an alternative system, and in Time and Tide, he turned from the science to the art of economics and threw out suggestions for an ideal commonwealth in conformity with the principles enunciated in the 2 earlier treatises. There was to have been a 4th stage in Ruskin's progress as a political economist. He had intended to pass from theory to practice and to initiate various schemes towards the realization here on earth of his ideal community. The story of this attempt and the story of the origin and purpose of the Guild of St. George belongs to the period of Fors Clavigera, that is to say, from the early 1870s onwards. Meanwhile, Ruskin had been very busy in following up Unto This Last and Munera Pulveris with letters to the principal British newspapers, defending and illustrating his views and meeting his critics full on. These documents are collected together in an appendix to volume 17 of the library edition, and they make fascinating reading. As we 4 embark on our reading of the first essay, The Roots of Honour, I want to emphasize how very influential Unto This Last has been. This could easily be the topic of a talk or a seminar in its own right, but I thought I would take the Mahatma Gandhi as one of the most striking and well-known examples. Famously, he was given a copy of the book in 1904 by a friend as he was about to embark on the long overnight train journey from Johannesburg to Durban. And he wrote afterwards, "The book was impossible to lay aside once I had begun it. It gripped me. I could not get any sleep that night. I determined to change my life in accordance with the ideals of the book." And later on, he was to write, "I believe I discovered some of my deepest convictions reflected in this great book of Ruskin. The teachings I understood to be that the good of the individual is contained in the good of all, that a lawyer's work has the same value as a barber's, inasmuch as all have the same right of earning their livelihood from their work, that a life of labor, that's to say, the life of the tiller of the soil, or the life of the handicraftsman, is the life worth living." We invite you to come on a journey with us, starting this evening, with two great questions in our minds. What precisely are what Gandhi called the ideals of the book, and how relevant are they to the circumstances of the present day? Our first reader is Dion Dobrinsky. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham, interested in literary responses to ecological crises. How wonderfully relevant is that to today? He is currently working on interdisciplinary and educational projects on forests and literature with the Guild of St. George and the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research at Ruskin Land in the Wyre Forest National Nature Reserve. Our second reader is Matt Sowerby, a writer and environmental activist from Cumbria and the fundraising coordinator for the Save Ruskin's View campaign, a very important campaign at the moment. He is also climate action lead in the National Trust's Regional Advisory Board for Northern England and director of the Kirby Lonsdale Poetry Festival. His work as a poet was celebrated at the United Nations headquarters in New York in 2022. Our third reader is Andreas Ammon, who began his career in Cologne as a highly skilled stonemason, but whose passion for architectural heritage led him to become an architect. For a decade, he worked at the Technical University in Dresden in the Department of Heritage, Conservation and Design. Currently, he runs a busy architectural practice of his own in Dresden, which is focused on the ethical repair and imaginative adaptation of historic buildings. The first voice you heard this evening was that of Simon Seligman, our part-time but tireless membership and communications officer, who has a background in art history. He worked for 19 years at Chatsworth, the historic estate, house and art collection in Derbyshire's Peak District, and who, alongside his work for the Guild, is a cultural lecturer and life coach in private practice. As Simon has said, I'm one of the directors of the Guild of St. George. I'm an architectural historian and conservation specialist, and on the board of the Guild, my special areas of interest are craftsmanship and building our international relationships. And it's a great joy to see on the screen a number of friends from other countries and continents here this evening. Dion, may I invite you to begin the reading of Unto This Last, please?
Among the delusions which at different periods have possessed themselves of the minds of large masses of the human race, perhaps the most curious, certainly the least creditable, is the modern soi-disant science of political economy, based on the idea that an advantageous code of social action may be determined irrespectively of the influence of social affection. Of course, as in the instances of alchemy, astrology, witchcraft, and other such popular creeds, political economy has a plausible idea at the root of it. The social affections, says the economist, are accidental and disturbing elements in human nature, but avarice and the desire of progress are constant elements. Let us eliminate the inconstants and, considering the human being merely as a covetous machine, examine by what laws of labor, purchase, and sale the greatest accumulative result in wealth is obtainable. Those laws once determined, it will be for each individual afterwards to introduce as much of the disturbing affection as he chooses, and to determine for himself the result on the new conditions supposed.
This would be a perfectly logical and successful method of analysis if the accidents afterwards to be introduced were of the same nature as the powers first examined. Supposing a body in motion to be influenced by constant and inconstant forces, it is usually the simplest way of examining its course to trace it first under the
Please refrain from speaking.
conditions, and afterwards introduce the causes of variation. But the disturbing elements in the social problem are not of the same nature as the constant ones. They alter the essence of the creature under examination the moment they are added. They operate not mathematically, but chemically, introducing conditions which render all our previous knowledge unavailable. We made learned experiments upon pure nitrogen and have convinced ourselves that it is a very manageable gas. But behold, the thing which we have practically to deal with is its chloride. And this, the moment we touch it in our established principles, sends us and our apparatus through the ceiling.
Observe, I neither impugn nor doubt the conclusions of the science, if its terms are accepted. I am simply uninterested in them, as I should be in those of a science of gymnastics, which assumed that men had no skeletons. It might be shown on that supposition that it would be advantageous to roll the students up into pellets, to flatten them into cakes, or to stretch them into cables, and that when these results were effected, the reinsertion of the skeleton would be attended with various inconveniences to their constitution. The reasoning might be admirable, the conclusions true, and the science deficient only in applicability. Modern political economy stands on precisely similar basis. Assuming not that the human being has no skeleton, but that it is all skeleton, it founds an ossifiant theory of progress on this negation of soul. And having shown the utmost that may be made of bones, and constructed a number of interesting geometrical figures with death's head and humeri, successfully proves the inconvenience of the reappearance of the soul among these corpuscular structures. I do not deny the truth of this theory, I simply deny its applicability to the present phase of the world.
This inapplicability has been curiously manifested during the embarrassment caused by the late strikes of our workmen. Here occurs one of the simplest cases, in a pertinent and positive form, of the first vital problem which political economy has to deal with, the relation between employer and employed. And at a severe crisis, when lives in multitudes and wealth in masses are at stake, the political economists are helpless, practically mute. No demonstrable solution of the difficulty can be given by them, such as may convince or calm the opposing parties. Obstinately, the masters take one view of the matter, obstinately the operatives another, and no political science can set them at one.
It would be strange if it could, it being not by science of any kind that men were ever intended to be set at one. Disputant after disputant vainly strives to show that the interests of the masters are, or are not, antagonistic to those of the men. None of the pleaders ever seeming to remember that it does not absolutely or always follow that the persons must be antagonistic because their interests are. If there is only a crust of bread in the house, and mother and child are starving, their interests are not the same. If the mother eats it, The children want it. If the children eat it, the mother must go hungry to her work. Yet it does not necessarily follow that there will be antagonism between them, that they will fight for the crust, and that the mother, being strongest, will get it and eat it. Neither, in any other case, whatever the relations of the persons may be, can it be assumed for certain that, because their interests are diverse, they must necessarily regard each other with hostility and use violence or cunning to obtain the advantage.
Even if this were so, and it were as just as it is convenient to consider men as actuated by no other moral influences than those which affects rats or swine, the logical conditions of the question are still indeterminable. It can never be shown generally either that the interests of master and labourers are alike, or that they are opposed, for according to circumstances, they may be either. It is, indeed, always the interest of both that the work should be done right, and a just price obtained for it. But in the division of profits, the gain of one may or may not be the loss of the other. It is not the master's interest to pay wages so low as to leave the men sickly and depressed, nor the workman's interest to be paid so high wages if the smallest of the master's profits hinder him from enlarging his business or conducting it in a safe and liberal way. A stoker ought not to desire high pay if the company is too poor to keep the engine wheel in repair.
And the varieties of circumstance which influence these reciprocal interests are so endless that all endeavor to deduce rules of action from balance of expediency is in vain. And it is meant to be in vain. For no human actions ever were intended by the Maker of men to be guided by balances of expediency, but by balances of justice. He has therefore rendered all endeavors to determine expediency futile for evermore. No man ever knew or can know what will be the ultimate result to himself or to others of any given line of conduct. But every man may know, and most of us do know, what is just and what is an just and unjust act. And all of us may know also that the consequences of justice will be ultimately the best possible both to others and ourselves, though we can neither say what is best or how it is likely to come to pass. I have said balances of justice, meaning in the term of justice to include affection, such affection as one man owes to another. All right relations between master and operative and all their best interests ultimately depend on these.
We shall find the best and simplest illustration of the relations of master and operative in the position of domestic servants. We will suppose that the master of a household desires only to get as much work out of his servants as he can at the rate of wages he gives. He never allows them to be idle, feeds them as poorly and lodges them as ill as they will endure, and in all things pushes his requirements to the exact point beyond which he cannot go without forcing the servant to leave him. In doing this, there is no violation on his part of what is commonly called justice. He agrees with the domestic for his whole time and service and takes them, the limits of hardship in treatment being fixed by the practice of other masters in his neighbourhood. That is to say, by the current rate of wages for domestic labour. If the servant can get a better place, he is free to take one, and the master can only tell what is the real market value of his labour by requiring as much as he will give. This is the politico-economical view of the case, according to the doctors of that science. who assert that by this procedure the greatest average of work will be obtained from the servant, and therefore the greatest benefit to the community, and through the community by reversion to the servant himself. That, however, is not so. It would be so if the servant were an engine, of which the motive power was steam, magnetism, gravitation, or any other agent of calculable force. But he being, on the contrary, an engine whose motive power is a soul, the force of this very peculiar agent, as an unknown quantity, enters into all the political economists' equations without his knowledge and falsifies every one of their results. The largest quantity of work will not be done by this curious engine for pay or under pressure, or by help of any kind of fuel which may be supplied by the cauldron. It will be done only when the motive force, that is to say, the will or spirit of the creature, is brought to its greatest strength by its own proper fuel, namely by the affections.
It may indeed happen, and does happen often, that if the master is a man of sense and energy, a large quantity of material work may be done under mechanical pressure, enforced by strong will and guided by wise method. Also, it may happen, and does happen often, that if the master is indolent and weak, however good-natured, a very small quantity of work, and that bad, may be produced by the servant's undirected strength and contemptuous gratitude. But the universal law of the matter is that, assuming any given quantity of energy and sense in matter, in master and servant, the greatest material result obtainable by them will be, not through antagonism to each other, but through affection for each other. And that if the master, instead of endeavoring to get as much work as possible from the servant, seeks rather to render his appointed and necessary work beneficial to him, and to forward his interests in all just and wholesome ways, the real amount of work ultimately done, or of good rendered, by the person so cared for, will indeed be the greatest possible. Observe, I say, of good rendered, for a servant's work is not necessarily or always the best thing he can give his master, but good of all kinds, whether in material service, in protective watchfulness of his master's interests and credit, or in joyful readiness to seize unexpected and irregular occasions of help. Nor is this one whit less generally true, because indulgence will be frequently abused and kindness met with ingratitude. For the servant who, gently treated, is ungrateful, treated ungently, will be revengeful, and the man who is dishonest to a liberal master will be injurious to an unjust one.
In any case, and with any person, this unselfish treatment will produce the most effective return. Observe, I am here considering the affections wholly as a motive power, not at all as things in themselves desirable or noble, or in any other way abstractly good. I look at them simply as an anomalous force, rendering every one of the ordinary political economist's calculations nugatory. While even if he desired to introduce this new element into his estimates, he has no power of dealing with it. For the affections only become a true motive power when they ignore every other motive, and condition of political economy. Treat the servant kindly, with the idea of turning his gratitude to account, and you will get, as you deserve, no gratitude, nor any value for your kindness. But treat him kindly without any economical purpose, and all economical purposes will be answered. In this, as in all other matters, whosoever will save his life shall lose it. Whoso loses it shall find it.
The next clearest and simplest example of relation between master and operative is that which exists between the commander of a regiment and his men. Supposing the officer only desires to apply the rules of discipline so as, with least trouble to himself, to make the regiment most effective, he will not be able, by any rules or administration of rules on this selfish principle, to develop the full strength of his subordinates. If, a man of sense and firmness, he may, as in the former instance, produce a better result than would be obtained by the irregular kindness of a weak officer. But let the sense and firmness be the same in both cases, and assuredly the officer who has the most direct personal relations with his men, the most care for their interests, and the most value for their lives, will develop their effective strength through their affection of his own person, and trust in his character to a degree wholly unattainable by other means. This law applies still more stringently as the numbers concerned are larger. A charge may often be successful, though the men dislike their officers. A battle has rarely been won unless they loved the general.
Passing from these simple examples to the more complicated relations existing between a manufacturer and his workmen, we are met first by a certain curious difficulties, resulting apparently from a harder and colder state of moral elements. It is easy to imagine an enthusiastic affection existing among soldiers for the colonel. Not so easy to imagine an enthusiastic affection among cotton spinners for the proprietor of the mill. A body of men associated for purposes of robbery, as a Highland clan in ancient times, shall be animated by perfect affection, and every member of it be ready to lay down his life for the life of his chief. But a band of men associated for purposes of legal production and accumulation is usually animated, it appears, by no such emotions, and none of them are in any wise willing to give his life for the life of his chief. Not only are we met by this apparent anomaly in moral matters, but by others connected with it in administration of system. For a servant or a soldier is engaged at a definite rate of wages for a definite period, but a workman at a rate of wages variable according to the demand for labor, and with the risk of being at any time thrown out of his situation by chances of trade. Now, as under these contingencies, no action of the affections can take place, but only an explosive action of disaffections, two points offer themselves for consideration in the matter. The first, how far the rate of wages may be so regulated as not to vary with the demand for labor. The second, how far it is possible that bodies of workmen may be engaged and maintained at such fixed rate of wages, whatever the state of trade may be, without enlarging or diminishing their number, so as to give them permanent interest in the establishment with which they are connected, like that of the domestic servants in an old family, or an esprit de corps, like that of the soldiers in a crack regiment.
The first question is, I say, how far it may be possible to fix the rate of wages irrespectively of a demand for labour. Perhaps one of the most curious facts in the history of human error is the denial by the common political economist of the possibility of thus regulating wages. While for all the important and much of the unimportant labour on the earth, wages are already so regulated. We do not sell our prime ministership by Dutch auction, nor on the decease of a bishop, whatever may be the general advantages of simony, do we yet offer his diocese to the clergyman who will take the episcopacy at the lowest contract. We, with exquisite sagacity of political economy, do indeed sell commissions, but not openly generalships. We do not inquire for a physician who takes less than a guinea. Litigious, we never think of reducing 6 and 8 pence to 4 and 6 pence. Caught in a shower, we do not canvass the cabman to find one who values his driving at less than a 6pence a mile. It is true that in all these cases there is, and in every conceivable case there must be, ultimate reference to the presumed difficulty of the work or number of candidates for the office. If it were thought that the labour necessary to make a good physician would be gone through by a sufficient number of students with the prospect of only half-guinea fees, public consent would soon withdraw the unnecessary half-guinea. In this ultimate sense, the price of labour is indeed always regulated by the demand for it. But so far as the practical and immediate administration of the matter is regarded, the best labour always has been and is, as all labour ought to be, paid by an invariable standard.
What? The reader perhaps answers amazedly. Pay good and bad workmen alike? Certainly. The difference between one prelate's sermons and his successors, or between one physician's opinion and another's, is far greater as respects the qualities of mind involved, and far more important in results to you personally than the difference between good and bad laying of bricks, though that is greater than most people suppose. Yet you pay with equal fee, contentedly, the good and bad workman upon your soul, and the good and bad workman upon your body. Much more may you pay contentedly with equal fees the good and bad workman upon your house. Nay, but I choose my physicians and my clergymen, thus indicating my sense of the quality of their work. By all means, also choose your bricklayer. That is the proper reward of the good workman, to be chosen. The natural and right system respecting all labour is that it should be paid at a fixed rate. But the good workman employed, and the bad workman unemployed. The false, unnatural, and destructive system is when the bad workman is allowed to offer his work at half price and either take the place of the good or force him by his competition to work for an inadequate sum.
This equality of wages, then, being the first object towards which we have to discover the directest available road. The second is, as above stated, that of maintaining constant numbers of workmen in employment, whatever may be the accidental demand for the article they produce. I believe the sudden and extensive inequalities of demand, which necessarily arise in the mercantile operations of an active nation, constitute the only essential difficulty which has to be overcome in a just organization of labor. The subject opens in too many branches to admit of being investigated in a paper of this kind, but the following general facts bearing on it may be noted. The wages which enable any workman to live are necessarily higher if his work is liable to intermission than if it is assured and continuous. And however severe the struggle for work may become, the general law will always hold that men just get more daily pay if, on average, they can only calculate on work 3 days a week than they would require if they were sure of 6 days a week. Supposing that a man cannot live on less than a shilling a day, his 7 shillings he must get, either for 3 days violent work or 6 days deliberate work. The tendency of all modern mercantile operations is to throw both wages and trade into the form of lottery and to make the workman's pay depend on intermittent exertion and the principal's profit on dexterously used chance.
In what partial degree, I repeat, this may be necessary in consequence of the activities of modern trade, I do not here investigate, contenting myself with the fact that in its fatalist aspects, it is assuredly unnecessary and results merely from love of gambling on the part of the masters and from ignorance and sensuality in the men. The masters cannot bear to let any opportunity of gain escape them, and frantically rush at every gap and breach in the walls of fortune, raging to be rich, and affronting with impatient covetousness every risk of ruin, while the men prefer 3 days of violent labour and 3 days of drunkenness to 6 days of moderate work and wise rest. There is no way in which a principal who really desires to help his workmen may do it more effectually than by checking these disorderly habits both in himself and them, keeping his own business operations on a scale which will enable him to pursue them securely, not yielding to temptations of precarious gain, and at the same time leading his workmen into regular habits of labour and life, either by inducing them rather to take low wages in the form of a fixed salary than high wages, subject to the chance of their being thrown out of work, or, if this be impossible, by discouraging the system of violent exertion for nominally high day wages, and leading the men to take lower pay for more regular labour. In effecting any radical changes of this kind, doubtless there would be great inconvenience and loss incurred by all the originators of the movement. That which can be done with perfect convenience and without loss is not always the thing that most needs to be done, or which we are most imperatively required to do.
I have already alluded to the difference hitherto existing between regiments of men associated for purposes of violence and for purposes of manufacture, in that the former appear capable of self-sacrifice, the latter not, which singular fact is the real reason of the general lowness of estimate in which the profession of commerce is held as compared with that of arms. Philosophically, it does not, at first sight, appear reasonable. Many writers have endeavoured to prove it unreasonable, that a peaceable and rational person whose trade is buying and selling should be held in less honour than an unpeaceable and often irrational person whose trade is slaying. Nevertheless, the consent of mankind has always, in spite of the philosophers, given precedence to the soldier. And this is right. For the soldier's trade, verily and essentially, is not slaying. but being slain. This, without well knowing its own meaning, the world honors it for. A bravo's trade is slaying, but the world has never respected bravos more than merchants. The reason it honors the soldier is because he holds his life at the service of the state. Reckless he may be, fond of pleasure or of adventure. All kinds of by-motives and mean impulses may have determined the choice of his profession and may affect, to all appearance exclusively, his daily conduct in it. But our estimate of him is based on this ultimate fact, of which we are well assured, that put him in a fortress breach, with all the pleasures of the world behind him, and only death and his duty in front of him, he will keep his face to the front, and he knows that this choice may be put to him at any moment, and has beforehand taken his part, virtually takes such part continually, does, in reality, die daily.
Not less is the same respect we pay to the lawyer and physician, founded ultimately on their self-sacrifice. Whatever the learning or acuteness of a great lawyer, our chief respect for him depends on our belief that, set in a judge's seat, he will strive to judge justly, come of it what may. Could we suppose that he would take bribes and use his acuteness and legal knowledge to give plausibility to iniquitous decisions? No degree of intellect would win for him our respect. Nothing will win it, short of our tacit conviction that in all important acts of his life, justice is first with him, his own interest second. In the case of a physician, the ground of the honor we render him is clearer still. Whatever his science, we would shrink from him in horror if we found him regard his patients merely as subjects to experiment upon. Much more if we found that, receiving bribes from persons interested in their deaths, he was using his best skill to give poison in the mask of medicine. Finally, the principle holds with the utmost clearance as in respects clergymen. No goodness of disposition will excuse want of science in a physician, or of shrewdness in an advocate. But a clergyman, even though his power of intellect be small, is respected on the presumed ground of his unselfishness and serviceability.
Now, there can be no question but that the tact, foresight, decision, and other mental powers required for the successful management of a large mercantile concern, if not such as could be compared with those of a great lawyer, general, or divine, would at least match the general conditions of mind required in the subordinate officers of a ship or of a regiment or in the curate of a country parish. If therefore all the efficient members of the so-called liberal professions are still somehow in public estimate of honor preferred before the head of a commercial firm, the reason must lie deeper than in the measurement of their several powers of mind. And the essential reason for such preference will be found to lie in the fact that the merchant is presumed to act always selfishly. His work may be very necessary to the community, but the motive of it is understood to be wholly personal. The merchant's first object in all his dealings must be, the public belief, to get as much for himself and leave as little to his neighbor or customer as possible. Enforcing this upon him by political statute as the necessary principle of his action, recommending it to him on all occasions, and themselves reciprocally adopting it, proclaiming vociferously for law of the universe that a buyer's function is to cheapen and a seller's is to cheat, the public nevertheless involuntarily condemn the man of commerce for his compliance with their own statement and stamp him forever as belonging to an inferior grade of human personality.
This they will find eventually they must give up doing. They must not cease to condemn selfishness, but they will have to discover a kind of commerce which is not exclusively selfish. Or, rather, they will have to discover that there never was or can be any other kind of commerce. That this which they have called commerce was not commerce at all, but cozening, and that a true merchant differs as much from a merchant according to laws of modern political economy as the hero of Wordsworth's Excursion from Autolycus. They will find that commerce is an occupation which gentlemen will every day see more need to engage in, rather than in the businesses of talking to men or slaying them. That in true commerce, as in true preaching or true fighting, it is necessary to admit the idea of occasional voluntary loss. That sixpences have to be lost, as well as lives, under a sense of duty. That the market may have its martyrdoms, as well as the pulpit, and trade its heroisms, as well as war. May have. In the final issue, must have, and only has not had yet, because men of heroic temper have always been misguided in their youth into other fields, not recognizing what is in our days perhaps the most important of all fields, so that while many a zealous person loses his life in trying to teach the form of a gospel, very few will lose £100 in showing the practice of one.
The fact is that people never have had clearly explained to them the true functions of a merchant with respect to other people. I should like the reader to be very clear about this. 5 great intellectual professions relating to daily necessities of life have hitherto existed. 3 exist necessarily in every civilized nation. The soldier's profession is to defend it, the pastor's to teach it, the physician's to keep it in health, the lawyer's to enforce justice in it, the merchant's to provide for it. And the duty of all these men is, on due occasion, to die for it. On due occasion, namely, the soldier, rather than leave his post in battle, the physician, rather than leave his post in plague, the pastor, rather than teach falsehood, the lawyer, rather than countenance injustice, the merchant. What is his due occasion of death?
It is the main question for the merchant, as for all of us. But truly, the man who does not know when to die does not know how to live. Observe, the merchant's function, or manufacturer's, in the is used here, the word must be understood to include both, is to provide for the nation. It is no more his function to get profit for himself out of that provision than it is a clergyman's function to get his stipend. This stipend is a due and necessary adjunct, and not the object of his life, if he be a true clergyman, any more than his fee or honorarium is the object of life to a true physician. Neither is his fee the object of life to a true merchant. All three, if true men, have a work to be done irrespective of fee, to be done even at any cost, or for quite the contrary a fee, the pastor's function being to teach, the physician's to heal, and the merchant's, as I have said, to provide. That is to say, he has to understand to their very root the qualities of the thing he deals in, and the means of obtaining or producing it. And he has to apply all his sagacity and energy to the producing or obtaining it in perfect state, and is distributing it at the cheapest possible price, where it is most needed. And because the production or obtaining of any commodity involves necessarily the agency of many lives and hands, the merchant becomes, in the course of his business, the master and governor of large masses of men in a more direct, though less confessed way than a military officer or pastor, so that on him falls, in great part, the responsibility for the kind of life they lead. And it becomes his duty not only to be always considering how to produce what he sells in the purest and cheapest forms, but how to make the various employments involved in the production or transference of it most beneficial to the men employed.
And as into these two functions, requiring for their right exercise the highest intelligence, as well as patience, kindness, and tact, the merchant is bound to put all his energy, so for their just discharge he is bound, as soldier or physician is bound to give up, if need be, his life in such a way as it may be demanded of him. Two main points he has in his providing function to maintain. First, his engagements, faithfulness to engagements being the real root of all possibilities in commerce. And secondly, the perfectness and purity of the thing provided, so that rather than fail in any engagement or consent to any deterioration, adulteration, or unjust and exorbitant price of that which he provides, he is bound to meet fearlessly any form of distress, poverty, or labor, which may, through maintenance of these points, come upon him.
Again, in his office as governor of the men employed by him, the merchant or manufacturer is invested with a distinctly paternal authority and responsibility. In most cases, a youth entering a commercial establishment is withdrawn altogether from home influence. His master must become his father, else he has, for practical and constant help, no father at hand. In all cases, the master's authority, together with the general tone and atmosphere of his business, and the character of the men with whom the youth is compelled in the course of it to associate, have more immediate and pressing weight than the home influence, and will usually neutralize it either for good or evil, so that the only means which the master has of doing justice to the men employed by him is to ask himself sternly whether he is dealing with such subordinate as he would with his own son, if compelled by circumstances to take such a position. Supposing the captain of a frigate saw it right, or were by any chance obliged, to place his own son in the position of a common sailor, as he would then treat his son, he is bound always to treat every one of the men under him. So also, supposing the master of a manufactory saw it right, or were by any chance obliged, to place his own son in the position of an ordinary workman, as he would then treat his son, he is bound always to treat every one of his men. This is the only effective, true, or practical rule which can be given on this point of political economy. And as the captain of a ship is bound to be the last man to leave his ship in case of wreck, and to share his last crust with the sailors in case of famine, so the manufacturer, in any commercial crisis or distress, is bound to take the suffering of it with his men, and even to take more of it for himself than he allows his men to feel. As a father would in a famine, shipwreck, or battle, sacrifice himself for his son.
All which sounds very strange, but the only real strangeness in the matter being, nevertheless, that it should so sound. But all this is true, and that not partially nor theoretically, but everlastingly and practically. All other doctrine than this respecting matters political being false in premises, absurd in deduction, and impossible in practice, consistently with any progressive state of national life. All the life which we now possess as a nation showing itself in the resolute denial and scorn by a few strong minds and faithful hearts of the economic principles taught to our multitudes, which principles, so far as accepted, lead straight to national destruction. Respecting the modes and forms of destruction to which they lead, and, on the other hand, respecting the farther practical working of true polity, I hope to reason further in a following paper.
Well, there we have it. We've soldiered through the first essay, and I found it a very moving experience, first of all, because our voices have been so different, but we've taken it at a steady pace and really listened to one another. And I must say, I found Unto This Last a book that I struggled with in early days of encounter with Ruskin, but studying it together, as we have done recently, has brought a new light into my life, which I'm really grateful for. And I'd love to know if the same is true of others.
Peter, it's Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I have a comment to make about this essay, which is really so incredible. And I certainly enjoyed the reading that you folks have worked so hard to make intelligible to us in the human voice in the air, as opposed to the human voice on the page. The first point I want to make is that it's very, very important in going through all four of these essays to always keep in mind the metaphor of unto this last. The biblical parable on which it's based is marvelous, and Ruskin refers to it time and time again, either directly or by allusion, as he works through all of his points. All of the five great professions that he's talked about in here, which is so important to this essay, are all based on the idea of service. The roots of honor, as I see it, the roots of honor are service, service to others. All professions exist with one intent only: to serve somebody, to provide somebody with something that they do not need, but which they wish to have. And that the specialist in whatever, whether it's fixing your car or turning on the lights or putting food on your table, are all your servants in a way. And every one of them, this idea of unto this last, you pay them all enough to allow them to live decently, and their job is to give you their product at the highest possible quality at the lowest possible price. So keeping in mind unto this last, always the metaphor is there. The thing that sets the vineyard owner apart from so many other people historically and currently is that he decides on his own initiative to do what he believes is right, and Ruskin believes is right, to serve those who work for him to make sure they're paid decently, whether they begin at the beginning of the day or the middle of the day or near the end of the day. They all need their penny a day to survive. So keeping the metaphor of unto this last in mind throughout all these essays is essential to understanding them. Well, that's enough for now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. We'll hold that in our hearts as we go through the different sessions. Thank you very much, Jim. I'm glad we could hear you so well. Others who might like to comment? Bob Richmond, you're next to Jim on my screen. Have you anything you'd like to say?
Well, hello, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we have to find here is basically the applicability of all of this into the present day. So it's a matter of, I feel that what it is here, it's a matter of editing and having to bring a very sort of crucial edit of Ruskin's Unto This Last into the present day, to give it applicability and a modern sort of idiom, as it were. So, I think that's how I feel about listening to this, because obviously, there are certain difficulties with reading Ruskin in the original text, in that it is obviously mired within its time, and within within issues of employer and the employed, which in some ways are, and in some ways are not pertinent to our time. And so I think it's, from my perspective, it's good, as Jim said, to hear the words being spoken as opposed to simply being on the page. But I feel that we have to find ways in which to really, really sort of bring these things, into the present moment.
Thank you. I feel a great sense of the compassionate Ruskin, especially in those closing paragraphs. It's so beautiful, but alas, as I think you're hinting, Bob, not at all reflecting much of the modern world, where a very small number of people become excessively and incredibly and unbelievably rich. And I very much doubt if they treat their workmen as though they were their sons, for example. Now I'm going to ask Matt, who is deeply imbued in 19th century literature, I believe. How were you reading this for the first time the other day when we had our go through together?
I'd say it was my first time out loud. I kind of, I'd encountered it on the page before. I think when I encounter things on the page, then I probably have a tendency to skim a little bit. So reading it out loud definitely allowed me to take it in more fully. I think it does still have a lot of since reading it, I've always been thinking about why is it that we kind of don't expect honor from business people in the same way that we do from soldiers and clergymen and the like. I think that's still a really relevant point when we think about like water companies and that kind of thing these days, and kind of the expectations that we have for the for nationalized industries versus private industries. I think there's a lot.
So for you, it was a really worthwhile exercise. Great, wonderful. And Andreas, I remember you said something very memorable last week, where you could see the applicability to your own company, wasn't that right? And we all said how wonderful it was and how you ought to be writing the introduction. Would you like to say some of that again?
You're muted, Andreas.
Yeah, I would like to tell something else, which is actually in Germany, there's a small tendency which I like a lot, and after all these catastrophes and crises which we have made possible with our way of economy and of trading, there is the term gemeinwohlorientiert, That means oriented to public welfare, or oriented to that any kind of business should be should do something good for everyone who is in any way co-involved. And recently there are some projects in city centers to reanimate old industry buildings, for example, with living, with entertaining, with culture, and also with, for example, houses for elderly persons. And these big public real estate projects are driven by groups of people who are not interested in making the big gain, but who are interested in doing a proper business for the service for everyone. And that's a real new thing. And there are also foundations who are collecting money and who are supporting these projects. And it came up from being in an absolutely niche. Now it's, let's say, in a niche. So from 0.5% of the market, they are now at, let's say, 3.5% of the market. But that's 7 times bigger than 10 years ago. Yeah. So there is a movement. Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Andreas, can I just see that Bob has written in the chat asking if you could type in that German word for
Yeah, of course.
public spirited.
I did not open the chat. Will do so. Yeah.
Thank you. That would be helpful.
Yeah.
Dion, thank you for reading so beautifully. How has it come across to you, studying the text last week and this?
Well, I first read it 2 years ago now, I think. It was on a train journey up to Birmingham. And I nearly missed my stop because there are parts of it which, in all its seriousness of the subject, and obviously his Ruskin's feelings, there are parts of it which were quite entertaining, kind of surprisingly, you know, his use of analogy in particular. And I think that really came through today when we were reading it. It's much more conversational than you might expect an essay on political economy to be. So that's what I kind of appreciated. And of course, as Bob said about the applicable about the applicability of it to today in so many ways, you know, reflecting on the cost of living crisis and you know, so many economic decisions seeming to lack the humanity, or as Ruskin better put it, the social affection in their equation. So I found it really insightful.
Wonderful testimony. Thank you very much indeed. I don't
Peter,
see any.
I have a second comment to make if you want to.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So at the very beginning, in the very first paragraph, as it was read, and accurately so, because I followed along in my text, is the idea of social affection. Ruskin is fundamentally presenting, one of the reasons I hated him so much is that he's saying that you're all a bunch of presumably professing Christians and you act in this terribly unchristian sort of way. The great master told us to treat our neighbors as we would like to be treated ourselves. And throughout this essay is the fundamental idea that the right thing to do is to take care of those who come to you for whatever it is you can provide, and to take care of those whom you hire to help you take care of those who come to you for what you can provide. It's a very special thing, this theory of the affections. Fundamentally, under this last is based on the ideal of love, that human beings owe one another something. What do they owe each other? They owe each other love. They owe each other their energies and their ability to help each other get through this life, and to do the kinds of things that they are capable of doing that will help others get through this life. And this whole essay, again, I say the roots of honor are service to someone else, giving someone else of your own strength, intelligence, and energy, the things that will help them get on better in life. So this theory of the affections is fundamentally grounded in the entire set of 4 essays, as we will see as we proceed further.
It's very moving, isn't it? I mean, my experience in life has been that when people get on with each other, in other words, are able to express their affections or their liking in a work context, things go so much better. And it seems obvious in a way. I also feel there's a deeply Christian background to what Ruskin is saying. I don't know if others agree. And it's good that you remind us of the importance of bearing in mind the scriptural story that gave the work its title. Now, we haven't heard a woman's voice. Helen, your hand is up. I'm so thrilled. Do you know, I was thinking of asking you to come and join the discussion.
Oh, I hope I can say something sensible. I think most of us are fairly convinced of this treatise of Ruskin and find it, gladdening, for want of a better word. Some of us will have Christian beliefs that resonate with Ruskin's view. I think otherwise we could just look at this as basic respect for other human beings, although I take the point that Ruskin's meaning is more about social affection. What this has made me think is it's very much addressed to a society in which manufacture is huge, in which manufacture is using close-knit apprenticeship schemes that perhaps do approximate family relationships. What Ruskin couldn't have known about is the most terrible effects of multinational and global capitalism. And clearly, Ruskin is no Marxist at all, but if I can use the phrase alienation, the term alienation from that background, it's difficult to know how to interpret this work with the degree of alienation we suffer. Say if we are workers employed by Amazon in a warehouse, and who is the principal of Amazon? Who is it who owes us that duty of respect? Do you see what I'm saying? I'm running on without making a proper point. So we happen to live in, speaking from the UK here, we happen to live in a country that manufactures very little these days. So can we apply it to a service sector economy? We now have a national minimum wage, but would Ruskin think that helps us? We now have social security and that whole supportive economy, but that's not working. Again, that didn't exist when Ruskin was speaking. I think it throws up lots of questions as to how we interpret this work and make any reality of it in the current world. It's such an uplifting piece of work, but trying to apply it. And I would just say a couple more things. Is in the UK, I'm aware of two campaigns. I don't know a lot about them. One is called Tax Justice, and perhaps that is doing something to touch on these issues. And something else of which I'm even less aware is a body called the Equality Trust. So perhaps there are small movements that are not necessarily party politically aligned in our own country or in my country. Anyway, I will stop there, but it caused all these things to bounce around in my head. And I shall have to start trying to make sense of Ruskin's views given the modern day, as I say, global capitalist economy that is destroying us. Oh, could I say one more thing? A lot of this is about justice. And where we do have unscrupulous people in commerce at every level, we need a justice system that can hold people to account. And global capitalism gives us great difficulties there because we do not have global structures by which to hold people to account. I.e. the directors of multinational corporations and their major shareholders who pay us, a lot of us, our pensions eventually. And I don't know where we go with that.
We're
So,
caught in the moral maze as usual, aren't we? Mm. Well, what a wonderful intervention. I am glad you made it. Thank you very much.
not at all, thank you. I'll mute now.
Right. Marietta Crichton Stewart, are you still there? I can't see.
No, Peter, I think she's
No.
left the call.
Right.
So quite a few people
Is-
have had to leave the call. Yeah.
Right. Is anything in the chat, Simon, that we ought to pick up?
Well, two very nice compliments about the beautiful reading, and a message to me reminding the person of just how powerful an essay it is, and I was reflecting back to her that isn't it funny that sometimes hearing something out loud read to you can enter a different piece of the brain or the sensibility or the soul than reading it on your own. There's something different about being read to. I remember saying during last year's series that I hadn't been read to out loud since I was a child, and it sort of, there's something about that comfort of being held by other people again to read and sort of in their reading explain it to me. And so but no, there are no outstanding questions in the chat that I can see, and we're coming pretty much to time, so I think we've done extremely well. If there's anybody else who wants to add any final thought or reflection, Bob.
I just like to really add and sort of emphasize what Helen said, because I completely agree. In a sense, it's exactly how we can adapt the kind of gems of Ruskin's thoughts and writing to the modern day sort of predicaments. And one thing I wanted to share is that I got hold of a copy of this of Kenneth Clark's Ruskin Today, which is very, very good. I don't know if you all got this basically, but it's a fantastic sort of overview of Ruskin's works, and with a sort of superb introduction by Clark. And there's in particular a really wonderful passage by Ruskin on doing, and how he describes, the very act of doing, of road making and all this kind of thing in very great detail and with great passion. And so I'd really just, like to echo what Helen said, which is that, from where I can see, if we can find ways to make this really relevant, also, in the realms of education, because, if we can, it's really, about how we can, help young people, help people of Matt's generation, to sort of, live in a better world. So that's what I'd like to say. And thank you all. Thank you all for reading.
Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank my fellow readers. I know that we worked hard together and most enjoyably. And it was really lovely to do that work together. And I hope we could do some more work together. But as the series goes on, each
Thank
session
you.
will have a...
I gather we're close to signing off.
Yes,
I
that's
want to
right.
thank. I want to thank
like to...
both Peter and Simon very much for all the work you've put into this, and all the readers. I didn't know quite what the format was going to be like, but I thought it worked extremely well. So congratulations on that account. And please, Simon, before we sign off, remind us all of when exactly our next gathering is.
Oh, that would be really useful. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, you're ahead of me, Jim. Let me say it right now while the question is posed. The next session focused on the second essay and convened by companion Arjun Shivaji Jain, who was on the call earlier but has had to go to bed because it's very late in India, is at 11 a.m. UK time on Saturday, the 17th of February.
Good, thank you.
Okay. We varied the times between different sessions because we have this wonderful problem, which is we have companions all around the world in every time zone. And so we wanted to make sure at least 2 of the sessions would work well for companions in Japan who've expressed an interest, in India and elsewhere. And we're aware that the early ones are much less good for our friends in North America. Apologies for that, but we try to accommodate everyone we can.
It is an amazing thing, isn't it, that we're relatively small body, the Guild of St. George. Of course, we have friends beyond the membership. And I hope some people who are not yet companions will become companions. But we have this amazing geographical global spread. And it just goes to show that Ruskin still appeals to so many people in so many different ways, people in different walks of life, different cultures, different language groups, and so on. It's very, very remarkable. So bless you all for coming. It has been a very enjoyable hour and a half, and I look forward to seeing many of you at the next sessions. Good night, everybody.